Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Transit Choices meeting. My name is Robin Budish, and I am the Director of Transit Choices. Our mission is to advocate for a first-rate regional transit system in Baltimore and throughout Maryland. We're talking about a system that is equitable, efficient, safe, and reliable. It is our pleasure to host these meetings every month, at which we invite key leaders and transportation, really officials, if you will, with a lot of expertise in the transportation arena to share what is relevant and going on in the transportation arena today. It's been a very busy time, even though the legislative session has ended for this year. And with that said, what I'd like to do, we're going to switch the agenda around a little bit, and we're going to start with our first guest presenter, who is Sean Winkler. Sean is Senior Policy Advisor, Transportation Equity Engagement with the Maryland Department of Transportation. And Sean's presentation today is titled Federal Service Transportation Reauthorization, an Overview in MDOT Priorities. It's our pleasure to have Sean join us today. So without further ado, welcome, Sean.
Thank you, Robin. And it is wonderful to be back at Transit Choices. I think the last time I spoke to the group was about 3 or 4 years ago when the federal infrastructure law had just passed.
Yes.
So now we are officially full circle as we gear up for this today. So thank you so much for that, Robin. For those that don't know, I've also had the pleasure of working with Robin and Jimmy in other capacities, besides, in addition to having the opportunity to present today, and really appreciate the work of Transit Choices, and both of your leadership, especially as we work together closely to pass the revenue package this legislative session, that's really making, foundational reinvestments in Baltimore's transit system. So really appreciate that. I'm Sean Winkler again, serve as a policy advisor to Assistant Secretary Tony Bridges here at MDOT. Chairman Larry, I apologize as you've already seen this presentation, but you can bear with me, and we have some more nuances to it. But in addition, Robin just mentioned the state legislative session. But the federal government is also a critical partner to us, especially when it comes to our capital programs and delivery. The current infrastructure law is actually set to expire in approximately 1 year from now, which is really stunning. That kind of 5-6 years have really gone by in a blink of an eye. So I want to talk a little bit about how the federal government is involved in surface transportation, especially transit. What are some of the big picture things going on in DC right now that may impact positively or negatively the next surface transportation bill? And then we have been working hard, and I'll have some fun stuff to preview on some of our own priorities, especially working with MTA, given this audience to share some of the things we'll be advocating on with our federal delegation. So what the heck is the surface transportation bill? That's a tricky topic. But I would say there's really kind of two mechanisms at the federal level that fund transportation. On the left there, or at least my left, we'll see if I'm mirrored or not, you can tell me, is reauthorization. And reauthorization basically is the policy setting vehicle for surface transportation at the federal level. It also contains, unlike most other authorization bills, it also authorizes the Highway Trust Fund, which is primarily funded through federal motor, federal gas taxes. They're longer. They tend to be 5 years. They create new programs. They lay the groundwork for US DOT or FDA to issue new regulation. But they really are kind of the long-term policy framework, if you will, for federal transportation priorities. Then we have appropriations. This is going on right now on Capitol Hill, and appropriations are the year-to-year funding process, right? So say, for example, in reauthorization, we make a new grant program that's dedicated only to improving light rail stations, right? So that reauthorization would create that program, but it's up to the yearly appropriations for the most part to then go and fund that program. So that is really how the two sides of the coin work there. But given that Congress is becoming less and less productive legislatively, we're also seeing more and more policies start to fall in these yearly appropriations bills. So where are we today? So there's this little law called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law with, a really tiny $1.2 trillion in it. Super historic. For reference, that's about 3x where we were in the last surface transportation bill, which is really a stunning generational investment in transportation from the federal government. The federal government's role, I just really want to highlight that, it's primarily focused to capital funding to states and local governments. There are some operating programs, but by and large, federal funding focuses on capital. As I mentioned this already, it is expiring soon, and believe it or not, our Congress is already talking about the next reauthorization and what it may look like. But there is a lot of really great stuff in this bill. I mentioned, the 3X, the previous bill, what was also really unique, and it's provided MDOT, MTA, state and local transportation agencies across the country was some planning stability, because the IIJ actually contained a $550 billion advanced appropriation. So that pot of money is not subject to the annual appropriations. That was a down payment to provide a floor for all of these new programs and activities, which has really been phenomenal to know that, at least 550 is more or less in the bank. And then, of course, it created a lot of new programs to focus on all sorts of priorities that align with Maryland's priorities, whether that's transit investment, whether that's sustainability, whether that's resilience. Really some brand new programs. First time a climate change title was ever included in a surface transportation bill. So some really cool and novel stuff. So how is this going to play out? Wow. Look at all these committees. The Senate is a unique beast, as I think many people have seen at this point. So the U.S. Senate has 3 committees that oversee at some level the next surface transportation bill. There's the Environment and Public Works Committee. They're primarily focused on the highway and waterway infrastructure. So think federal highway, think U.S. Army Corps with the port. That would fall in the EPW land. Commerce, Science, and Transportation, Aviation, Maritime, Rail, and Safety. And then, of course, even though it's not even in the title of this committee, but Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs oversees the FTA portion. My first internships were in the House of Representatives, so I'm biased. But the House just has one committee to handle all of transportation and infrastructure issues called the T&I Committee. They keep it a little cleaner. Maybe a little more efficient over there in their majority rural body. But Maryland is really, really blessed to have wonderful representatives that we work with quite a bit at MDOT in consultation with the governor's office that will be in the driver's seat for the next transportation bill, including our newest Senator, Angela Alsobrooks, who serves on the Senate EPW committee, Senator Van Hollen, who serves on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, not listed here. He is also an appropriator. So he has a voice on both sides as this plays out. And then in the House, we have Andy Harris and Glenn Ivey, who also are appropriators. And those 4 in particular are really dialed in from a committee perspective on the next reauthorization. But there's a few challenges going on right now. I have this perhaps ominous looking chart, but I don't think, especially given our state issues, it's really a surprise to anyone here. But the gas tax federally, state level, many different regions is simply not keeping up with the pace of inflation and construction costs and supply chain challenges, labor costs, you name it. The gas tax is really no longer a sustainable revenue source to enable all of the things we want to do. And as you can see in this chart, the Highway Trust Fund itself is facing the same issues we are as a state. In the last surface bill and even prior, we've seen more and more bailouts, if you will, from the federal general fund being transferred to the Highway Trust Fund, as the federal gas tax, I believe, hasn't been raised since 1993 or 1994. So how are we going to pay for this stuff? I think what's unique about transportation is this kind of user fee model idea where the users of the system pay for it. There has been kind of a large bipartisan consensus on that. But, what does that look like? As I just mentioned, the general fund, are we going to move away from a user fee model or not? Just a few things nationally and globally: inflation, supply chain, and tariffs. Oh my, if we have any Dorothys out there, we're just facing a few challenges there. Was that 1.2 trillion a ceiling? When that transportation bill passed under President Biden, I would have told you at that time that absolutely that was a historic, once in a generation investment in transportation. But given all of the challenges we've seen from inflation, supply chain, tariffs, labor costs, you name it, we may be in a place nationally where that 1.2 trillion actually should be the floor, just because it's lost so much buying power. Are we going to see short-term extensions? That really harms us at MDOT and MTA and other places, because if programs are suddenly, we know that they're going to be there for 5 years versus they're there year to year. That's just a challenge for us as we plan our activities and capital projects. And then, of course, there's a lot of people that care about transportation on Capitol Hill. What will be the consensus positions amongst all the stakeholders? So this stuff is already well underway. The House Transportation Committee has already been working through this through stakeholder hearings. Same at the Senate. They are absolutely going through the motion of trying to at least have the groundwork in place for when the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act expires. And as a part of that, we've been engaging with Governor Wes Moore through his leadership with the National Governors Association to kind of prepare, some baseline high-level priorities for MDOT, and then we'll get a little more specific. But at a high level, we've coalesced around a couple of big topics here. Freight and supply chain. I think MDOT has a really unique perspective here, as we are a consolidated transportation department. We have the port under us. We also have motor vehicles under us from a commercial driver's license perspective. We've seen the current administration and Secretary Duffy really bring up the challenges around truck parking nationally, and things like that. Freight, as we saw with the tragic collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge, is a really big deal in the state of Maryland. Innovative finance. There are some programs I have up there, the Build America Bureau, where we're able to access loans at the federal level and things like that to advance projects. Predictable, sustainable funding. I don't think I need to spend much time on that. Obviously, some of the new climate title stuff we saw in the IIJA, we're going to continue to advocate for. Safety is huge, especially from a roadway perspective. We recently rolled out a complete streets policy across MDOT. Just earlier this week, the State Highway Administration was in Prince George's County on New Hampshire Avenue, or MD 650, to basically kick off their first pedestrian safety action plan funded project. And that is another component of the governor's transportation budget. So we're really focusing in on roadway safety for all vulnerable road users. Streamlining, projects take a long time. are there things we can do to ensure that the taxpayers of Maryland are seeing the results quicker of their taxpayer dollars? When we're seeing these revenue increases. And of course, MDOT is also super unique in that we support 2 urban transit systems from our Consolidated Transportation Fund. I don't think you'll find another state DOT in the country that does that. Okay, now we're going to get really nerdy here. But we also have a few specific priorities related to transit that were kind of in our larger one. So expanding eligibility for the Federal Transit Administration CIG, or Capital Investment Grant Program, which I think many folks are familiar with here. But they have kind of 3 components to the CIG program. There's the new starts, small starts, and those are really for like new expansion efforts. But they also have a core capacity program that you can access if you can kind of prove what you're doing will expand ridership by 10%, more or less. It's kind of the eligibility threshold there. But I think especially on East Coast states, especially in the Chicago area where there are legacy transit systems, there's no doubt in my mind with like the light rail vehicle modernization program that, while that is a state of good repair investment, MTA will tell you very eloquently, it's also a modernization, because we're not going to replace the original light rail technology with technology from the early 90s, right? We're going to replace it with the newest stuff that, enhances the system for years to come. And I think it would be our position that, that type of investment should be eligible, because you're making the system more attractive for riders, even if it's not at that 10% level. That I think over the long term, if we are modernizing and keeping our existing transit assets in a state of good repair, we will see ridership increase and ridership sustain. So that's that one. This one's even nerdier. Equal treatment of all passenger rail services before the Surface Transportation Board. So there is a railroad regulator called the FTB. It was originally the Interstate Commerce Committee, or Interstate Commerce Commission, excuse me. And it's kind of the legacy regulator of railroads in the United States. There is a unique distinction in federal statute between commuter railroads like MARC that are funded by state and local transportation dollars, and Amtrak, which is, primarily funded by federal funding, at least on its Northeast corridor and long distance service. But based on how the law is written, only Amtrak has access to the Surface Transportation Board to potentially resolve and mediate disputes over railroad trackage access agreements. Obviously, Amtrak, outside of the Northeast corridor, does really not own a single mile of track in the United States, so they fully rely on freight railroad systems to run their passenger service. That is primarily true with commuter railroads as well. MTA through MARC, has access agreements with Amtrak on the Penn line to access the Northeast corridor, as well as CSX on the Brunswick and Camden line. So we're just asking for equality there, that, a state and local taxpayer dollar, at least in my opinion, should have as much value as a federal one when it comes to expanding passenger rail services. And then very lastly, we're always hunting for operating sources in the federal government. Again, I mentioned they're primarily capital, but we have kind of a concept around, is there an opportunity where we're meeting certain state of good repair thresholds that we'd be able to flex certain funds that are dedicated to state of good repair federally to operating. Super simple idea, tied to a metric. But that's really that one is kind of the specific thing. So I'm sorry if I bored everyone with those very in-depth topics, but I'm happy to answer any questions about what we're seeing on the policy side, and also happy to go into anything with the current administration as well. And that is me at the end. And with that, I'm going to hit stop, Robin, and I will turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Sean. If you have a question or a comment for Sean, You may either raise your hand or you can certainly put it in the chat. I did see a hand earlier. I'm not sure. Let me just double check if that person. Okay, I think not. Sean, I'd like to kick off the Q&A by asking, as I always do with you, what can Transit Choices and other, transit-related advocacy organizations do to support your efforts, particularly, as it relates to, what you shared with us today?
I think, thanks for that, Robin. I think all of the tactics you just, executed in Annapolis are absolutely applicable at the federal level. We have wonderful representatives that want to hear from you, that are on committees that matter in the next bill. And, we would certainly welcome any type of outside support, around our priorities that have been vetted both, MDOT wide as well as the governor's office. So, we're aligned on our vision here, and certainly welcome, the voice from the outside, right? Because it's just different, when those office holders hear from the advocates than they hear from us, because I think we're a little more seen as, the technical advice. You guys are the constituents, right? You guys are the people that are invested in this.
Right.
So, any of the tactics you just went through, Robin, we would certainly welcome on the federal level.
Sure. I mean, certainly, when I say we, I say the transit advocacy, all of the organizations sort of coalesced when we testified in Annapolis, as well as, the BRTC and others, and, that sort of resulted in significant additional funding for transportation. So we are happy to support this effort as well. So thank you. Jimmy?
Yeah, Sean, as you know, the General Assembly state approved Governor Moore's amended transportation budget, and that allowed us to really keep the system we have in good repair, make some definite improvements with the light rail. But if we're really going to build a great transit system in the Baltimore region, we're going to have to find additional revenue, an additional revenue stream to fund capital projects in the future, which would expand our regional transit system. Do you have any thoughts on where such funding could come from in terms of the federal government? And what are the likelihoods of us accessing a dedicated revenue stream?
Thanks, Jimmy. Always love your vision and passion. I think I'll keep my comments to the first part of your question on where the federal government can come in. But, I did briefly mention that capital investment grant program. That is Federal Transit Administration kind of dedicated program to specifically transit expansion. But there are others. In the surface transportation bill, they created this new program called MEGA that was really focused on the projects that were really too big to advance without federal transportation dollars. And they have a threshold in there of it has to be at least 100 million, it has to be at least 500 million. So that program is really quote unquote focused to mega projects. And that is a competitive discretionary grant program that does allow for certain transit eligibilities in there. So there are certainly tools at the federal level that can be accessed to it. As you highlighted, Jimmy, revenue source questions at the state and local level are critical. For these funds, we do have to match them. And I think in this current administration, if it's anything like the last time they were in power, they pay a special emphasis on which local and state governments are matching and over matching. that was a high preference for them last time.
Klaus?
Thank you.
Yeah, on federal funds that are already allocated or granted to the Baltimore region, I think of the Douglas Tunnel and the Highway to Nowhere money for study and for construction even, and then the replacement of the light rail cars and so on. Now, those monies, are they in your mind safe, or are they subject to impoundments from the federal government? And what's your risk assessment there?
Sure. Thanks for that, Klaus. I will say, if you would have asked me that 2 to 3 months ago, it was a pretty dark time for us. I'd say in April, when Secretary Duffy issued that follow the law letter and started to then execute some of those provisions in that letter, like, federal immigration conditions as a part of our federal funding agreement. To be frank, if we were to accept those conditions, we would be actively violating state law. And that really put us almost in an impossible bind of, violating our own laws and state priorities, when there are quote unquote billions of dollars dangled on the other side that, quite frankly, our system needs. So they really put us, quite frankly, in an extremely inappropriate position. But thanks to the leadership of Governor Moore and Attorney General Brown, we were granted and won a preliminary injunction at the end of June that basically said that the federal immigration condition is illegal. And we have thus far seen no signs of USDOT appealing that. In fact, they have now started to amend their funding agreements for the 20 states that prevailed. And now, as opposed to an immigration enforcement condition in their grant agreements, they're now writing language on how an injunction is in place and the state does not have to comply with it. So since we've seen that, Klaus, I can tell you for a fact the light rail vehicle grant is obligated. I think we've been public with that. The other two grants you mentioned, MDOT is not the direct recipient of those. So, I'd of course refer you to the direct recipients on that. But from my MDOT hat, the clouds have very much been lifted and we are able to move federal money again, by and large.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions or comments for Sean? Well, Sean, thank you again so much on behalf of Transit Choices and all of the meeting attendees for your time and really thorough presentation. Very, very helpful, very relevant. And we know that you've got another commitment. You're speaking on a panel momentarily. So
almost on the same topic. So we're having fun this morning.
Oh, good, good. Well, anyway, thank you again. We are happy to share your presentation with the meeting attendees at the conclusion of this meeting. So we will be in close touch. And as always, please reach out to Transit Choices for the support that you need.
Thanks as always, Robin. Thanks, Jimmy.
You're welcome. It is now my pleasure to introduce Maryland State Delegate Mark Edelson, who represents the District 46. Mark was extremely busy during the last legislative session, and certainly we will be gearing up soon for the 2026 legislative session. We are thrilled, given his busy schedule, that he is joining us today. The discussion is going to be a post-session wrap-up, and Delegate Edelson will provide updates from the 2025 legislative session. He's also going to discuss his legislative portfolio and share what he is looking forward to next year. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Robin. It's great to be with you all this morning. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. Let me just start by saying, as a legislator, our job is to do our best to find the money for our state agencies to do what they need to do. And for all of us here, transportation is absolutely top of mind. But that's only as effective as the folks at those agencies who are actually using the money. And I think, as you can see with the presentation we just had from Sean, the talent level at MDOT right now is extremely high. And I can say as a legislator, I'm very fortunate to know that when we do everything we have to do to raise the funds necessary, that it's in the hands of incredibly capable people like Sean and his colleagues at MDOT to make sure that those funds are used appropriately, for the best use of Maryland residents. So with that, I'm going to jump into my presentation. As Robin mentioned, Mark Edelson, I represent the 46th Legislative District in the House of Delegates. It's an honor for me to represent this district with my colleagues, Robin Lewis and Lou Clippinger in the House, and Senator Bill Ferguson, who is our Senate President in the Senate. The four of us work very, very closely together on everything that we do. And frankly, that working relationship is a big reason as to why we were able to have so many of the wins that we had this session, both for the district, but really for the entire city of Baltimore, the Baltimore region, and the state of Maryland. To give a discussion of what we did and what we sort of went through the gambit of this session, I think it's helpful to have a little context on the budget overall, and then I'll sort of drill down on the transportation related aspects. So I sit on the House Appropriations Committee, which is the budget committee in the House. I'm also the vice chair of the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee, and I sit on the Personnel Oversight Subcommittee on Appropriations. And so obviously in the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee, my focus is squarely on our state agencies that handle all of our needs in the state of Maryland that involve transportation, the environment, and anything related. So we oversee all the budgets for MDOT, the port, the airport, State Highway Administration, MTA, also, the Energy Administration, the Public Service Commission, the Office of People's Counsel that deals with our utility issues, and then the environmental agencies as well, DNR, Department of the Environment, et cetera. So it's a pretty broad portfolio of agencies whose budgets we oversee in our subcommittee. In the full committee of the Appropriations Committee, we oversee all of the state budgets. And so, that is really our focus. And as a legislature, I've mentioned this before, but we have one constitutional obligation. The only thing we are absolutely required to do every year by the Maryland Constitution is to pass a balanced budget. So our expenses have to meet our revenues every year, and we cannot leave Annapolis and come home to our families, and in my case, my 2-year-old son, until we pass a balanced budget. And this year, that was particularly challenging. I've spoken to a lot of legislators who have served far longer than I have, who all share the same sentiment, which is this is one of the most challenging sessions any of us have ever been through. There are really three main reasons for this, three main drivers of the budget challenges we had this year. First is healthcare. During COVID, our Medicaid rolls absolutely exploded. Many of those Medicaid recipients are young children whose parents unfortunately lost their lives to COVID. The expectation was at the time that we would see a significant increase in the Medicaid rolls during the outbreak of COVID, and once things sort of slowed down, those numbers would shrink, but they haven't. And it is very, very expensive for us as a state to ensure that every Medicaid recipient is appropriately compensated and has the medical care that they need. But we made a commitment as a legislature to the most vulnerable Marylanders, unlike, frankly, our federal government, that we would do everything in our power to ensure that our Medicaid recipients have what they need. Not to mention, we also believe that it's good economic policy, because if you help people have preventative care and regular checkups at their doctors and physicians, less people are going to the emergency room all the time and putting much more of a strain on the medical system. So that was one. Two is the child care scholarship system. A few years ago, we did some studies and analysis, and in fact, the comptroller put out a very extensive report showing that young mothers were having children and not coming back to the workforce in astronomical numbers. And the reason is because of the incredibly high cost of childcare. As we all know, frankly, as I said, I have a 2-year-old. I know both how challenging it is to find childcare and how expensive it is to pay for. And so we made a decision as a legislature and with the governor to create a scholarship fund for low-income families to have access to affordable childcare. What we didn't fully appreciate was the scope and scale of the need of that system. And so while we expected a few thousand people to apply, we have had tens of thousands of Marylanders apply for that. And so on the one hand, this was good because we found a problem and we were solving for it. On the other hand, from a budgetary standpoint, it's an incredible strain. But again, we made the decision that if folks needed childcare, were low-income families, hit the metrics and applied for the system, we were going to have the money there to ensure that they could get it so families could get back into the workforce and be a part of the labor market. The third is the Trump administration. So there's an independent entity that sits within the Bureau. It's called the Bureau of Revenue Estimates. They sit within the Comptroller's office and they analyze the revenues in the state of Maryland every year, every few months, and report to us as the legislature, and particularly the budget committees, how much money is coming into the state of Maryland every year from our tax revenues, and project what those future revenues will be so that we have good facts and data when we're making our budgetary decisions in order to balance our revenues and our expenses. They met in September of last year and told us that as a result of these massive issues, Medicaid, childcare scholarships, inflation, et cetera, the deficit that we were going to have to close this session was $2.7 billion. They met again in March, 6 months later, and as a result of the actions of the federal administration in DC, they told us that our deficit was now $3.3 billion, that it had grown by $600 million in 6 months. That is a catastrophic and scary change in our revenues. And so during this session, we had to do something about it. And we had to close this $3.3 billion gap. The way that we did it was in essentially 2 main ways. One is we cut very, very, very difficult cuts, very challenging cuts that we had to make to certain programs. Some of them were a little bit easier because they were programs that hadn't necessarily been functioning at their highest capacity. Some of them were a lot more challenging, but we did it so we could protect our Medicaid recipients, our child care scholarships, public education, public safety, the Developmental Disabilities Administration that was at risk for a huge cut. And the other huge chunk of money that we brought in is the revenue raises that we did, right? As many of you, I'm sure, know, if not all of you, we raised taxes this session. The way that we did that was particularly targeted, okay? 94% of Marylanders will either see a decrease or a flat in their state income taxes. So the revenues that we raised this session, $1.3 billion, are from the wealthiest 6% of Marylanders, folks who are making over $500,000 or $1 million a year. And frankly, in my opinion, I don't think that that necessarily gets enough airtime, right? Everybody is always saying, let's raise some more revenue from the wealthiest folks and ensure that they're paying their fair share. That's exactly what we did this year. So ultimately, we were able to close that very, very challenging budget gap through those 2 measures. I could talk for hours about the details, but I want to get to the transportation stuff. But I want to make sure everybody has the context of what we did this session. And like I said, in so doing, when we came into session, there's a proposal for $100 million cut to the Developmental Disabilities Administration. This is the organization that helps our most vulnerable, developmentally disabled Marylanders. What we did this session avoided those cuts in their totality. There were potentially going to be cuts to our public school system. We avoided those cuts. There were going to be cuts to healthcare. We avoided those cuts. Cuts to public safety. We avoided those cuts. And as many of us know, there were going to be massive cuts to our transportation system, which we were able to avoid. So let's jump into that right now. In September of last year, the MDOT, Department of Transportation, released their draft CTP, right? This was the original draft Consolidated Transportation Program. It's a 6-year plan, but they update it every year. In that original draft, there was $672 million in cuts just to MTA alone. There were cuts to every agency across the system. When MDOT and MTA came to Baltimore to talk about their CTP, Many of you were there. Your elected officials stood up with a united voice and said, this is not acceptable. We know this is a challenging budget time, but we have to find solutions to these problems that does not result in us balancing the budget on the backs of Baltimoreans again. And the reality is that the Moore Miller administration and MDOT listened to us and they said, we get it. We agree. You're right. And when they proposed a final CTP just before session, it had restored almost all of those cuts. But what we had to do was to work with them to find the money to make sure that we could actually restore those cuts. And ultimately, what we were able to do this session is to raise around $500 million per year to go to the Transportation Trust Fund, which, as you all I'm sure know, is the main fund that all of our transportation programs are funded through. So 500 million this year. We raised about 350 million last year. So across the 2 years, that's about 850 to 900 million in new money going into the Transportation Trust Fund every single year, which is a huge, huge deal. It was an incredible amount of work, negotiating, late nights, sleepless nights, early mornings, frankly, with many of you, stakeholders, advocates, helping us to make the case to our colleagues as to why this is so important. We were able to put that money into the system. And at the end of the day, I would go anywhere in the state and say this. The biggest beneficiary by far of this transportation funding increase is Baltimore. There's no doubt about it. We were able to restore almost all of the cuts to the MTA, Maryland Transit Administration. That's about 200 new PINs, meaning new employees that they can hire as bus drivers, supervisors, mechanics, light rail drivers, supervisors, HR, procurement, across the board to make the system more effective and more reliable. A massive ability to hire new people. We're also replacing all the elevators and escalators at our metro stations. There are marked improvements in this. We're going to be purchasing zero-emission buses. There's going to be revenues coming to reverse the cuts to the port and to the airport for massive infrastructure programs that they have. This also puts more money into the Red Line Fund. So we have money sitting there ready to go. And money is going to mobility this year. And as Sean mentioned just before I got on, the $1.3 billion complete modernization and overhaul of our light rail system is fully funded. The first major investment that we have made in the system since it was built is happening now, thanks to the work that we all did together this legislative session. Another particular thing that's relevant to the city is we were able to restore $1.5 million for the Greenway Trail Network that was unfortunately misplaced, let's say, a few years ago, that was at risk of being lost forever. We were able to restore this session. So we're keeping moving forward on the Greenway Trail Network. The other thing we did is we protected HUR money, highway user revenue money, which is the money that comes to the city of Baltimore to maintain our roads, our bridges, our highways, to build pedestrian access, ADA accessibility, bike lanes, walking trails. Baltimore City has not had a significant investment in capital for DOT for over a decade. We finally got that money back. It was at risk of being cut again this year, but we were able to avoid those cuts. And as a result, in Baltimore City's capital plan for this year that they just released, they're going to be repaving, resurfacing, fixing 111 miles of roadway in Baltimore City this year. That is the biggest number in as long as anybody can remember. So that is a big, big deal. And, with that money, as Sean mentioned, now that this cloud has sort of lifted a little bit around the federal administration, you can also use it to draw down additional federal monies. You can use it to bond against, to get more money for the system for capital programs. And so much of this is coming to Baltimore. It is a big, big deal. It's not everything. There's still a lot more work to do, but in a very, very challenging time, thanks to the work that we all did together, that's where we're at right now. And for me, I am just over the moon with what we were able to do this year. And I'm excited to come back next year and keep the momentum moving. Just to talk a little bit, if I can, Robin, about a couple of my bills, and then I'm happy to open it up to questions. One of the bills that I introduced this year is a very sort of nerdy, wonky thing called Garvey funding, which is that essentially there's a system that allows us to draw down money and increase our bonding authority based on future federal money that we know we're going to get, and we can use that money to pay the debt service. It allows us to be creative and fund big infrastructure projects now. My bill would have allowed us to use that money for the light rail system. Ultimately, that idea then got incorporated into the budget. And so that bill was put into the budget and passed, and we're going to use a lot of that Garvey money to fund the light rail overhaul, which I was extremely excited about. Another one that's not specifically transportation funding, but is intended to keep us safer on the roads, is a bill to increase penalties for aggressive and reckless driving. As many of us know, especially coming out of COVID, people are driving on our roadways like absolute maniacs. We have a goal called Vision Zero in the state of Maryland, which is to achieve zero roadway fatalities or major pedestrian accidents. Unfortunately, in the last few years, we've been moving in the opposite direction on that. And I think that we just need to get stricter with folks who are repeatedly, specifically, breaking the rules of the road and putting us all at risk. So I worked with a colleague of mine in Montgomery County, and we were able to pass legislation this year that will increase penalties for folks who are driving aggressively and recklessly on our roadways, particularly repeat offenders. The other one is I worked with folks at the MVA, the Motor Vehicle Administration, to expand the options and the process that they have for folks who are international drivers who move to Maryland and are going to be getting their Maryland license. Up until now, as part of that process, there was a 3-hour alcohol and drug seminar that they had to take prior to getting their license. This was written in state law that the only thing that could be taught during that time is alcohol and drug awareness. We thought that doesn't make sense. Obviously, you need a significant amount of alcohol and drug awareness, but you also need other things if you're an international driver coming to the U.S. about the rules of the road that might be different here than from your home country. As someone who's from another country, I know this very well. And so we worked together to pass legislation to change that state law to allow the MVA to provide significantly more robust training on the rules of the road in Maryland for our international drivers before they get their driver's licenses. And then the other one, the biggest one for me, the one that still has a hole in my heart right here, the TCA, the Transportation and Climate Alignment Act, which so many of you worked incredibly hard with me. Obviously, we were not able to get that over the finish line this year. What that would do is mandate that MDOT has to do an assessment on all major highway expansion projects to determine if the project would increase greenhouse gas emissions. If the answer is yes, they would have to either slow down the project, change the project, or create a sister project of some kind of transit, land use, et cetera, that would net out those greenhouse gas emissions. And the idea is that we would really focus our priorities on big infrastructure projects that aren't just going to add more lanes on a highway, more traffic on our roads, more pollution in the air, more aggressive and reckless driving, but instead do the kinds of things that will help us move Marylanders around in a more effective, efficient way that's better for our local economy. So that was my big push this session. We unfortunately were not able to get it over the finish line, but I promise you I will be bringing it back next year. And I would just note that, that bill was really done in conjunction with incredible support and assistance from the folks at MDOT, which is interesting because this is a bill that is really going to tell them what to do. And nobody really likes being told what to do. But the culture at MDOT now under this administration is that they get it. They want to be doing these kinds of things. And that's why they worked with me on it. And my understanding is that even though the bill didn't pass, they are already going to be implementing some of the strategies from the bill itself in their daily processes. So that policy is moving forward. But in order to have it here with fidelity, in posterity, we have to memorialize it in law. And so I will be bringing it back next year. And if we don't pass it next year, and I'm fortunate enough to get reelected, I'll keep bringing it back until we get it over the finish line. And with that, I will stop talking and be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Mark. Do we have any questions, comments, feedback for Delegate Edelson? Jimmy. Jimmy, you're, yeah.
I feel after these two presentations, I just feel we're so lucky to have people like Sean and Mark working on these transportation issues in the legislature and at MDOT. And the level of expertise and competence and the good values that they show, we're just very fortunate in Maryland to have such good people in these positions. So thank both you and Sean for the work you do, Mark. It's incredible to me what you get done and your dedication to doing it. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. So that's my opening statement. Then I want to ask, I mean, we're talking about how we can improve our regional transit system. And to do that, we definitely need to find a dedicated revenue stream which would focus on improving the regional transit system in Baltimore. And do you have any thoughts about what possibilities there are to create such a dedicated revenue stream? And I see John Larry is on this meeting. BRTC's been charged with coming up with ideas to find a dedicated revenue stream. Are you working with BRTC at all on that project?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jimmy. I speak to John probably about as much as I speak to my wife, which is extremely frequently. So, we're working on these issues absolutely all the time. It is true that for our long-term solutions, we have to find a dedicated revenue source. The way that the system is funded and structured right now, in which everything is so top down, and everything is so sort of one budget that then flows down, is very, very challenging for our region, including from a representation perspective, right? So think about it this year. MDOT and MTA present their budgets to the two subcommittees in the House and the Senate that have jurisdiction over them on the budget side of things. Across those two subcommittees, I am the only legislator that represents Baltimore. So in order for us to really have more of a say in what happens to our system, we have to have a higher level of representation, but we also have to figure out a way to fix that structural mismatch. We have to figure out a way to have more control and power and governance over the decisions that are made in our region. John and the folks at BMC, BRTC, BRTB do an incredible job. But the authority that we collectively have is very limited. And so we have to find a new structure for the long term that gives us more authority. But the rub of that, the other shoe that has to drop is, in order for us to have that level of authority, we're going to have to put some real skin in the game. There's going to have to be some real money coming from the Baltimore region. And so that, I think, goes to your first point, Jimmy, about a dedicated revenue source. I am all for putting something big on the ballot, frankly. I mean, in this lost election, there were, I believe, 71 ballot measures around the country to increase transportation funding in specific areas for specific projects, and 71 of those passed, 84%, including in parts of the country that you think people would not be interested in paying 1 penny more in their tax money for any kind of transportation system. A huge, huge number of them passed. So I think one of the things we're going to have to do at the end of the day is just rip off the Band-Aid and give the choice to the voters. Are folks willing to pay an additional penny in sales tax to have the transportation system that our region needs? That's the question. Or, some other related revenue stream like that can be dedicated to the region, that can allow us to say, we're raising money of our own. We need authority. We need control. These two things have to go together. And long term, I think regional systems are the way that we're going to have to go throughout the state.
Thank you. Klaus?
Yeah, I'm all for structurally changing the revenue sources and structurally changing on how we manage our transportation system. But they seem to be long-term perspective, and they seem to be stalled currently. The Train Commission completely abandoned, and there are no results over all these years that we discussed this already. And I don't quite understand why in the short term we cannot raise the gas tax. This credo that the gas tax is obsolete and that it cannot solve our funding problems, I don't quite buy that. What we are doing, what we should be doing is defossilize our transportation system. And yes, in the long run, that would mean that there is less income from the gas tax. But we should do it like the cigarette tax, where we want people not to smoke anymore and we ratchet the taxes up. What we have done instead is we are charging electric drivers a penalty. And you know, I understand the logic, they're using the roads too, but if we want to really create a behavioral change, we should be consistent with all our policies. And if the federal government, we just heard that before from Sean, hasn't changed the gas tax since 1994, then we can certainly change the gas tax in the state more than the inflation adjustment that we already have. And this would solve a lot of our short-term transportation problems. And all the while we can think long-term about how we restructure this with VMT taxes or whatever.
Klaus, I don't disagree with you. I disagree with you on one thing, which is that I don't think the fees we're charging for electric vehicles should be considered a penalty. It's way, way less than what people who pay gas taxes pay. And it's really just a sense of some fairness, as you pointed out, that folks who are using the roads are paying for some level of the maintenance of them. You know, studies have repeatedly shown, even in states where they charge much more than us, it has not put a dent in the market for electric vehicles. I don't know that I would consider it punitive for those folks. That being said, as it relates to the gas tax, you have a number of allies in that mindset, including myself. I do think long-term, we have to recognize that the gas tax is not going to be the sustainable source of revenue that it once was. And we have to be planning for that future and ideally doing it in a smart way that incentivizes people to stop driving fossil fuel vehicles for sure. The challenge is, frankly, what I just pointed out, which is that when we have MTA come in front of the committees in the House and the Senate and present on their budget, there are not that many legislators there who are from the regions in which we would benefit the most from these kinds of policies. There are a group of us in the General Assembly, and we talk about and strategize on these things every day. But it's not that easy to get the votes of 188 people to increase the gas tax. But we do push for it every year. We will keep pushing for it, and I commit to you on that we'll keep doing it. But it's probably going to take leadership, I would suspect, from the governor to say this is what we're going to do, and then to really come to the table and negotiate with legislators to make something like that happen.
If I could just add a quick one on the road safety that you mentioned in the very beginning. You know that a big problem is that so many drivers are registered in Virginia and there is no reciprocity with Virginia, so they go often without paying any of their penalties when they get caught. Is there anything afoot that you would promote to change that?
Yeah, we ask MDTA, that the tolling authority, every year. They have been working on reciprocity agreements with a number of neighboring states, such that should someone in those states be coming into Maryland using Virginia tags and not paying our tolls, we have an ability to collect those, because right now we're not, and it's frankly a significant amount of money. But there is also legislation that is proposed every year. Here, Jackie Addison, my colleague, proposed a bill this year to try to clamp down on that. But the reality is that the law that's really going to change that has to come from Virginia. It has to be a Virginia law that tightens up how they give out licenses and tags and things in Virginia. But we are working, across agencies with our colleagues in Virginia to try to tighten that up, because I agree it's definitely a problem.
We have time for two more quick questions. Bill?
I'll be quick. Thank you, Delegate Edelson, for your leadership. Housing in the right places, especially near transit, is also a transportation solution. And MDOT had a bill last year on TOD that didn't get passed. They're able to do some things administratively, but I'm wondering if there's potential this General Assembly session for bills that support transit-oriented development, parking reform, things that can encourage more housing in the right places, so addressing housing and transportation needs.
I agree with you 1,000%, Bill. In fact, some of the ideas of that TOD bill came from a bill that I passed a couple of years ago that specifically focuses on Baltimore City and removing minimum parking requirements for new construction around transit stations. So I am with you 1,000% on that. I do believe that that form of a bill will be coming back this next year. And let me also say this, which is, because the budget was such a huge challenge this year, it also took up so much time and mental capacity. I mean, remember, we only have a 90-day session to pass a $67 billion budget and deal with approximately 3,000 bills that get introduced every year. So unfortunately, when you're dealing with that constrained of a time frame, very small things during the life cycle of a bill can end up, unfortunately, derailing it. And I think that's part of what happened with my bill, the TCA, as well. My hope is that next session, because we will be in an election year, and my guess is people won't necessarily want to do too much budgetary stuff, we can really focus on these system reforms that'll set us up for success going forward, just like TOD. And I'm hopeful that that will be successful next year. Let me also I just want to, sorry, Robin, I see Nikki's question in the chat. I just want to answer that for 10 seconds if I can.
Sure.
Which is, can you speak about some of the improvements that would improve paratransit services? So I also had a bill which we passed last year, which requires the Transportation Institute at College Park to do a study of our mobility and paratransit system at MTA and to determine whether or not the way that it's currently being operated is in fact the highest and best way to support our paratransit riders. That study should be coming out shortly, and I plan to use that for legislation this session to improve that system as well. So hopefully that answers your question, Nikki.
Mark, do you have time for one more brief question?
You got it.
Wonderful. Kathy?
Yeah, I'm with the MCRT, Maryland Coalition for Responsible Transit, and SC Maglev is visiting and influencing county councils, and I'm wondering if they're trying to do that in the Baltimore City Council, and also with the unions. I want to know what talk you are hearing about Maglev.
You know, they reached out to meet with me a couple of years ago. I met with them, listened to what they have to say. The biggest issue for me personally, as it relates to my district, is the way that it would negatively impact residents south of the Hanover Street Bridge in Westport and Cherry Hill, because the route would come right through their neighborhood and have significant negative impacts on the neighborhood. And I told that to them, and I told them that that was, among other things, an absolute deal breaker for me, because those neighborhoods are always the ones that get the short end of the stick with these kinds of things, and I wasn't willing to let that happen again. Since then, I haven't heard much from them. I have not heard any of my friends on the city council tell me that they have heard a lot from them. There was a bill this year in session that would have, you know, they always come and say they're never going to need public funding. So there was a bill this session to sort of tie them to that. And they, you know, they sort of pushed back saying, well, we're never going to need public funding, but we don't want to completely foreclose the opportunity for public funding. And the response was, well, if you're never going to need public funding, then what's the difference? And, you know, there was some discussion about that, but it never really went anywhere. And that's really all I heard about it during session, and I haven't heard anything from them since. So, you know, I know that they took the governor to see it, and he was, you know, very excited about it. But since then, I haven't heard anything else about it, to be honest.
Right, thanks.
Jimmy, would you like to provide closing remarks, please?
Yeah. Excuse me. Well, I've thanked the presenters already, and I can't do that enough. But thank you so much, Sean and Mark, for being here. But also, I'd like to thank all you who tune into these meetings, because your participation enables us to attract the presenters that we do and have these kind of discussions, which are so valuable, I think, in educating the public and pointing the way forward for advocacy from groups like ours. So by attending these meetings, you're doing more than just listening. You're actually advocating for a better transit system in a very positive way. So thank you all. And it's great to have you here in the middle of summer and to have such good participation. So thank you.
I echo Jimmy's sentiments and thank you all for your time and your continued interest in our mission in our advocacy work. I'd like you to mark your calendars for the next Transit Choices meeting. You will receive a notification. It will be held on Thursday, August 28th. We are delighted to announce that we have two very strong presentations, one from Holly Arnold, MTA Administrator, and also Veronica Macbeth, Director of Baltimore City Department of Transportation. So we wish you all a wonderful day, a wonderful month, and look forward to seeing you again on August 28th, if not sooner. Bye-bye.